Deep in the Central American rainforest, swallowed by vines and time, lie the ruins of a civilization so advanced, so vast, that it once rivaled ancient Rome. Palaces carved from limestone, pyramids that scraped the jungle canopy, star calendars more precise than the Gregorian clock. This was the Maya Empire, and then, seemingly overnight, it vanished. No invading army, no biblical flood, no volcanic ash, just silence. For centuries, explorers and scholars were left baffled. How could an empire of millions simply dissolve into moss and dirt? But as archaeologists dug deeper into the jungle and into the graves beneath it, they uncovered a truth far more disturbing than collapse by drought or war. The Maya didn't just disappear. Something ripped their world apart from the inside. A storm of blood, prophecy, and mass sacrifice, all tied to the stars above and the bones buried below. Because the Maya believed time was a serpent, and every few centuries, it demanded a feast of death to keep the world spinning. And when the last king made a desperate bargain with the gods, the price would echo for generations. This is not just a mystery of disappearance. It's a tale of cosmic terror, divine obsession, and the empire that sacrificed itself to survive. In 1839, two American explorers, John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood, battled through the thick jungles of Honduras and Guatemala, their boots sinking into mud, machetes swinging through green walls of vine and rot. What they found should have been impossible. Towering above the canopy was a stone temple, engraved with glyphs no European had ever seen. Beside it, wide boulevards choked with trees, observatories aligned with the heavens, and pyramids larger than those in Egypt, all built by a civilization thought to be primitive or extinct. The site was Copan, one of the many great cities of the ancient Maya. But Copan was only the beginning. Soon, dozens of lost cities emerged from the earth. Tikal, Calakmul, El Mirador, Palenque, and the shadowy kingdom of Dos Pilas, each one bigger, more elaborate, and more mystifying than the last. What shocked researchers wasn't just the scale, it was the sophistication. The Maya had a written language, advanced astronomy, complex mathematics, and monumental architecture that stood for over 1,000 years. They tracked solar eclipses, predicted planetary alignments, and built cities based on celestial movements. They had ball courts where losers weren't just defeated, they were sacrificed. They had temples where kings spoke to gods. And they built these wonders without metal tools or the wheel. But then, sometime between 800 and 900 CE, they stopped. City by city, kingdom by kingdom, the jungle reclaimed their temples. Carvings were left half-finished. Thrones were abandoned. Pyramids were swallowed in vines. And the Maya vanished. Historians once blamed drought, or civil war, or overfarming. But the pattern didn't make sense. Why did powerful cities like Tikal collapse completely while others, just miles away, survived for centuries more? And why, in so many cities, were the final monuments carved in desperation, filled with prophecies, doomsday glyphs, and gods demanding blood? The clues were buried under centuries of moss and something darker. In 2003, a team of archaeologists uncovered a sealed chamber beneath a pyramid in San Bartolo, Guatemala. Inside, they found a mural painted around 100 BCE, 800 years before the Maya collapse. It depicted a king offering his own blood to a god serpent, while priests cut open the chests of children and poured their hearts into a tree of time. Above it all loomed the Maya calendar, its cycles spinning toward an inevitable conclusion. This was not just art. This was a warning, one that had echoed through every Maya city, one that may have set the entire civilization on a course toward ritual suicide. Because in the Maya worldview, time was not linear. It was cyclical, and every few centuries, the world had to be fed, or it would end. And as the long count calendar approached its reset point, the gods grew hungry. To the Maya, time wasn't a river. It was a wheel, and that wheel turned with divine inevitability. Every cycle a repeat of cosmic birth, destruction, and renewal. Their infamous long count calendar, carved into obsidian stele and temple walls, wasn't just used to mark days. It was a sacred countdown, a clock ticking towards celestial convergence and spiritual reckoning. And deep within this mathematical marvel was a terrifying belief that every Bacton, a period of 394 years, demanded a sacrifice, not just of blood, but of civilizations. In our modern world, many remember the 2012 Maya calendar doomsday myth. But for the ancient Maya, that wasn't a joke. It was doctrine. Their inscriptions hinted at previous worlds, destroyed when gods grew displeased or hungry. They believed this current world was the fifth, and it, too, would end in agony unless properly fed. And that burden fell squarely on the kings. High atop pyramids, Maya rulers weren't just monarchs. They were living gods, chosen by bloodline and anointed by ritual. Their role wasn't political, it was cosmic. They alone could communicate with the divine, keep the stars aligned, and ensure rain fell on the fields. And when signs began to appear, crop failures, lunar eclipses, plague outbreaks, and strange celestial alignments, the kings consulted the Aj Kahun, the sacred scribes and astronomer priests. What they read in the stars shook them to the core. Carvings from Dos Pilas and Copan show a sudden shift around the 8th century. Glyphs go from celebrating royal births and victories to frantic inscriptions about omens, blood debts, and divine silence. Inscriptions describe terrifying prophecies delivered by Kawil, a serpent-footed god of fire and lightning. One prophecy, carved into a stela at Quirigua, warned, when the moon devours the sun and the serpent swallows the stars, the gods will demand their tithe. That tithe was blood, and it had to come from the mouths of kings. This sparked a wave of self-sacrifice never before seen in Maya history. At Yaxchilan, the queen is depicted running a spiked rope through her tongue. At Piedras Negras, a king slices open his penis with obsidian to feed the gods. At Bonampak, murals show royal families bleeding into bowls, surrounded by bone flute music and howling shamans. But the gods demanded more than symbolic pain. Soon, the kings turned to human sacrifice. Not just captives, not just enemies, but priests, scribes, children, and even nobles. Entire royal courts began interpreting the long count reset as a divine deadline, a moment when time itself would collapse unless soaked in blood. So they began building higher pyramids, holding longer rituals, sacrificing more victims. And it still wasn't enough. Because the rains didn't come, the soil turned to dust, and the stars shifted. One by one, cities turned on each other, kings went mad, and the ceremonies grew darker, more frenzied, more desperate. In Tikal, murals show priests decapitating women, painting the walls with their blood, and feeding entrails to obsidian idols. It was no longer about appeasement. It was about terror, about trying to stop time itself from collapsing. But no matter how much they offered, the gods stayed silent. And that silence broke the Maya world apart. By the dawn of the 9th century, the Maya lowlands, once a patchwork of thriving city-states, had become a battlefield soaked in fear and blood. The prophecies etched into the stars had come due. The rains refused to fall. The maize, sacred to the gods, withered in the fields. And the only solution, in the eyes of the priest-kings, was more blood. What began as ritual sacrifice of captives soon escalated into state-sponsored slaughter. The once beautiful plazas of cities like Dos Pilas, Aguatica, and Copan became charnel grounds. The smell of burning flesh lingered in the humid air. And in temple after temple, priests raised obsidian knives toward the heavens, asking the gods how much more they needed. In Bonampak, the murals once thought to glorify kings were later revealed to be testimonies of horror. Captured enemies flayed alive, their skin worn by priests as sacred garments. Children were bound and thrown down temple steps, their heads smashed on jagged stone altars below. But the most chilling sacrifices were reserved for the elite. Royal families, when caught in defeat, were not spared. In fact, they were prized offerings. A stela at Kalakmul records the execution of a rival dynasty's prince, his heart ripped from his chest and offered as a key to open the next cycle of time. Even kings began to fear their gods and each other. Political alliances crumbled. Former allies accused one another of displeasing the gods, of withholding sacrifices, of corrupting the cosmic balance. Wars weren't fought for territory anymore, they were fought for bodies. Each captured city was stripped of its citizens, not to enslave, but to sacrifice en masse. In Piedras Negras, archaeologists found a pit of nearly 100 skeletons, limbs bound, skulls shattered, arranged in perfect circles. Some had obsidian blades still lodged in their spines. Others had teeth filed into fangs, indicating they may have been ritual performers, people who became living masks of the gods before they were butchered. But it wasn't just the victims who suffered. The executioners, young men groomed from childhood to carry out the killings, often suffered psychological breaks. One mural at Yaxchilan shows a priest vomiting blood after a ceremony. Another depicts an executioner weeping while sharpening his blade, his face twisted in agony. It was as if even those within the system knew something was terribly wrong, that the gods weren't listening, or worse, that they had never been there at all. Still, the rituals continued. The Feast of the Flayed One, dedicated to the god Zyptotec, involved priests wearing human skin until it rotted off. The ritual was meant to symbolize rebirth and the cycle of agriculture. But in the drought-stricken cities, it became a desperate plea to force life from death. Entire weeks were consumed by these acts. Children paraded through streets with painted skulls. Women sang funeral hymns that hadn't been heard for generations. And kings sat on thrones made of human bone, their feet resting on skulls, as they watched the sun vanish behind a wall of smoke and ash. The gods, it seemed, demanded not just obedience, but madness. And as the sky grew darker and the rivers dried to dust, one city after another fell into chaos. Some burned. Others were abandoned overnight. But the greatest horror wasn't in what was happening. It was in what came next. Because the Maya weren't just sacrificing others. They were preparing to sacrifice themselves. The deeper archaeologists dug, the darker the truth became. Beneath the vines and moss, under centuries of sediment and silence, they found not ruins, but cemeteries. Entire temples built not on bedrock, but on layers of human bone. And at their center, altars stained permanently with blood, blackened stone that reeked of burnt flesh, even after a millennium. In Uxmal, deep in the Guatemalan lowlands, a royal tomb was unearthed beneath the central plaza. It was expected to hold jade, gold, and ceremonial masks. Instead, it held something far more chilling. 24 severed heads, each placed facing outward in a perfect circle, mouths frozen open, as if screaming into eternity. They weren't trophies of war. They were citizens. Sacrificed, scholars believe, in a final act of ritual surrender, a city's offering of itself to the gods when no other tribute remained. Similar discoveries emerged across the ruins. In Cancuin, a once prosperous trade hub, dozens of nobles were executed and dumped into a sacred reservoir. No signs of battle, no enemy conquest, just ritualized extermination. The bones tell the story, skulls split cleanly, ribs cracked by blades, children strangled with braided vines. It was as though cities had imploded, not from foreign invasion, but from internal rot. In Siebel, archaeologists uncovered a hidden pyramid beneath a larger one. Inside, an ossuary chamber held over 200 skeletons, layer upon layer of systematically dismembered remains. They weren't buried in haste. Each body had been laid with care, adorned with ceremonial pigments, obsidian knives, and fragments of bone flutes. A few were even defleshed before burial, scraped clean by tools, their skeletons painted red, then reassembled into ritual patterns beneath the pyramid. Not as humans, but as symbols. Symbols of desperation. Symbols of a people trying to turn the very dead into prayers. But perhaps the most disturbing sight was Köpen's Temple 26, a step pyramid with a crypt beneath it. There, researchers found an arrangement of skulls forming a throne-like structure. Upon it sat the skeleton of a man in regal attire. His jaw was broken, his ribs shattered, his heart cavity empty. Carbon dating revealed a terrifying fact. He was one of the last kings of Köpen, sacrificed by his own people. The glyphs nearby explain why. The inscription reads, "He did not feed the gods. He did not speak the sky's name. He brought silence." This was not just ritual. It was revolt. The priests, the people, even the royal guard, turned against their king, believing him responsible for the divine silence. He had promised the gods would answer, that blood would bring rain, that the calendar would restart. Instead, there was only dust. It was the ultimate sacrifice, the death of a god king, killed to preserve a collapsing belief system. a desperate act to prevent the unthinkable truth that the gods might be gone, that no one was listening anymore. And yet, even then, the killings didn't stop, because the calendar hadn't reached its end. Not yet. And the final city, the holiest city of them all, was preparing for its last offering. In the sacred highlands of modern-day Guatemala, the final curtain of Maya civilization began to fall, not with war or fire, but with a sky that refused to speak. The city was Tikal, once the crown jewel of Maya power, a city of 90,000 souls whose temples scraped the clouds. By the year 869 CE, the last of its dynasties still clung to the illusion of control. The stars had stopped moving in the ways the scribes predicted. The rains didn't come. The crops failed for the 5th year in a row. And still, the rituals continued. Because they had to. The priests insisted the calendar was reaching a sacred convergence, one that occurred only once every 5,125 years. If they missed this alignment, if the gods were not fed during this moment, the world would spiral into darkness. Forever. So they prepared the final offering. Carved tablets describe the days leading up to the event. All prisoners were sacrificed. Noble families volunteered their second-born children. Virgin women were isolated for fasting and purification. Shamans roamed the streets in feathered cloaks, screaming warnings of divine extinction. And then the eclipse came. The day turned to night. The sun blackened. And with the sky in full shadow, the high priest of Tikal stood atop Temple 4, the tallest structure in the empire, holding a jade blade in one hand and a newborn child in the other. Thousands knelt below in silence. The blade fell. Blood spilled onto the obsidian altar. But the eclipse continued. The wind died. The jungle went still. And the gods remained silent. In that moment, something cracked in the Maya psyche. What it held for over 2,000 years, faith, fear, blood, sacrifice, shattered in the face of cosmic indifference. The priests had promised that the stars would return, that the sun would blaze anew, that the gods would speak again. But they didn't. The eclipse passed, the night resumed, and nothing changed. No rain, no voice from the heavens. Only silence. Across the empire, cities went dark. Some were burned by their own people. Others were simply abandoned. Food stores were left untouched. Stone tools lay scattered across temple floors. The Maya walked away from their gods, from their calendars, from the very concept of time itself. No battle marked the end. No final war. Only vanishing. And the jungle crept in behind them, swallowing the pyramids, the ball courts, the hieroglyphs, until all that was left were bones. And the final chapter still lay buried, beneath centuries of rot and roots, waiting to be uncovered. Because while the people disappeared, the truth didn't. And what modern archaeologists would find next would explain why the Maya chose extinction over survival. In 2018, a team of archaeologists using LiDAR technology scanned vast portions of the Guatemalan jungle from the air. What they discovered stunned the world. Hidden beneath the canopy were over 60,000 ancient structures, temples, homes, fortresses, and entire cities once thought lost. The Maya hadn't been a scattered people. They were part of an enormous, interconnected civilization, a jungle empire stretching over 40,000 square miles. But what truly shocked researchers wasn't the scale, it was the suddenness of its fall. The deeper the digs went, the more consistent the pattern became. Mass graves, burned temples, half-built pyramids, incomplete inscriptions, and always the same eerie conclusion, an abrupt stop. Why? Until recently, most scholars blamed drought, soil exhaustion, or intercity warfare. But new evidence revealed something more disturbing. They knew the end was coming, and many chose not to stop it. In burial pits from Dos Pilas to Uxmal, skeletons showed signs of extreme malnutrition even before the collapse. Yet temples were still being built. Rituals still carried out. Sacrifices increased, not decreased. The Maya weren't trying to survive. They were preparing to die. In 2022, bioarchaeologists discovered ceremonial sites where entire lineages were buried together. Parents, children, servants, all laid out in ritual positions, surrounded by offerings. The soil around them was scorched, indicating intentional burning, not by enemies, but by their own people. Even more shocking were the inscriptions. A fragment found near La Corona read, "We return to the cave. We walk backward through the world. The gods did not come, so we go to them." It was a voluntary extinction. The Maya, bound by a cosmic worldview, believed that if the gods abandoned them, then their purpose ceased to exist. And so, in an eerie act of collective surrender, they chose to vanish, leaving behind temples instead of tombstones, glyphs instead of gravestones. This wasn't a civilization wiped out by nature. It was a civilization that chose silence over survival, ritual over rebellion, death over doubt. But even in extinction, the Maya left behind echoes. Echoes that still call from the jungle. Echoes that warn what happens when belief becomes obsession, when systems are built on fear, and when a people surrender logic for prophecy. Today, the descendants of the Maya still live, proud, resilient, and thriving. But the empire they inherited is buried in the bones of the past. A past that reminds us, the gods we worship can destroy us. And sometimes, we're the ones who light the fire. What you just heard is not a myth. It's a documented, excavated reality of a civilization that chose ritual death over uncertain life. If this story made you think, if it disturbed you, or if you want to uncover more of history's darkest truths, make sure to subscribe, comment your thoughts. Was this faith? Or was it fear? Watch another shocking story in our series on forgotten empires, forbidden rituals, and dark human extremes. Because history isn't dead, it's just buried. And sometimes, what we dig up changes everything.